All right, everybody, we are picking up where we left off with the decline of the Minoans, and just in time, about 1600 BCE, the Mycenaeans are going to take advantage of that volcanic eruption and tidal wave that weakened the Minoans, and they are going to take over. And they are going to be around only until about 1200 BCE. So the Minoans were in charge for over 1,000 years, but the Mycenaeans were just about 400. So that's a little bit of a big time difference. That didn't make any sense. A little bit of a big time difference. That's all right. So the Mycenaeans were the first advanced civilization on the Greece mainland. Mainland going to be the key word there. So we know that the Minoans were first down on the island of Crete, but back up on the mainland, the Mycenaeans were the first powerful group that ever settled there. So if we take a look at our map, right, the Minoans were down here on Crete with their capital city of Knossos, and the Mycenaeans were going to be up here in the city-state of Mycenae or Mycenae, up on the Greek mainland down here on the Peloponnesus. So, as we said, the city of Mycenae served as the center of their government. And they were headed or ruled by a king, just like the Minoans. We know stuff about them because they kept detailed records of their personal wealth and money for tax purposes. And they had to pay taxes to the government in wheat, livestock, so that's, their farm animals, and honey. Honey was an important good there in ancient Greece. We know that the Mycenaeans traded with the Minoans, who they eventually ended up taking over. We also know that they traded with the Egyptians and civilizations in Asia Minor, which means places like Persia and also Mesopotamia. So we can tell already from there, that's a lot of travel, a lot of trade with a lot of different cultures. So what are we going to have happening? Cultural diffusion. Another way that cultural diffusion is going to happen during this time is through war, because they also went to war with nearby civilizations using bronze weapons, which were really powerful at the time. Give you just a second to make sure that you are all caught up on your notes. Right, so it was during this time that a famous Greek poet named Homer, not Simpson, wrote about their war with the city-state of Troy. So, whoops. If we take a look at our map here, right? So we've got the Mycenaeans up here who are trading all across the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea, and they are eventually going to go to war with the city-state of Troy, also known as the Trojan War. Let's get set back up here. Homer wrote a famous epic poem called the Iliad, which tells the story of the Trojan War and how the Mycenaeans tricked the Trojans and won. We are going to go into the story of the Trojan horse a little bit more, but the basic premise of the story is that after a long, long time of fighting, the Greeks couldn't get into the city-state of Troy because the walls were so big and such good defense that they pretended that they were leaving. So they sailed their ships away and hid overnight, and they left a giant horse on the beach outside the city walls, which the Trojans thought was a gift for Poseidon. So they rolled the giant horse into the city to take it to Poseidon's temple as an offering, but it really was a trick, and the soldiers were hiding inside. And then they came out in the middle of the night and let the rest of the army, which had traveled back to Troy, in, and that was pretty much all she wrote. They won the war that night. We will talk more about Homer and his poems, whether or not he's real or a myth, whether or not he actually wrote them, and more about the Trojan War a little bit later on. So, in the 1100s BCE still, the Mycenaeans and other Bronze Age civilizations started to collapse. So even though they were powerful, they did control the Aegean Sea, and they were really involved in trade in the Mediterranean. They did start to collapse, partially because of internal fighting, invasions, or natural disasters, and also because iron is going to be discovered, and people are going to start are going to start using weapons made out of iron, and so they're going to defeat their opponents because iron beats bronze every time. So guys, before we get into the Dorians taking over, I did want to mention, I forgot to say this when we were talking about the Trojan War before. So the legend of the Trojan War says that the Mycenaeans and the Trojans were fighting because a Greek Mycenaean princess named Helen had been kidnapped by the Prince of Troy. And so it's said that that is what started the war. And they actually fought for 10 years before the war ended. But that is, there's not really archaeological evidence. We're not sure whether or not the Trojan War ever actually happened. But if it did, more than probably being about a kidnapped princess, it was probably more about control of trade in the ancient economy, because you can see you've got Mycenae here and Troy over here, and in between them is, we know, the all-important Aegean Sea, because whoever controlled the Aegean controlled the trade, who controlled the money. So that is probably what the Trojan War was about, and I just forgot to mention that to you before. So let's get started talking about the Dorians, because up until now, the Greeks had made a lot of progress. They had developed a lot of stuff, and they had a really good, prosperous society going. But the Dorians are going to come in and jack all of that up. They are going to come to power right around 1100 BCE as the Mycenaeans are declining. And like the Mycenaeans, they're not actually going to be in charge that long. They're only going to be around until about 750 BCE. And as we said before, one of the reasons that they are going to be able to take over after the Mycenaeans is because the Mycenaeans were fighting with bronze and the Dorians were fighting with iron, which is a stronger weapon. So they are going to come in and conquer the Greek mainland where the Mycenaeans had set up their civilization, and they're going to rule for about 300 years. This period is called the Dark Age because the Dorians, and I remember that Dorians were the ones that started the Dark Age because they both start with D. The Dorians were really good at fighting and really good at war, but not very good at much else. They did not value education, and so a lot of the advancements of the Greek civilization are going to be forgotten for a while after they take over. So during this time, thousands of Greeks that lived on the mainland actually fled and settled in Ionia to escape the violence of the Dorians. So if we take a look at our map, this is where the Dorians are taking over. And so a lot of the Greeks that don't want to be under their control are going to travel over here to the coast of Persia in this area called Ionia. They're going to settle here. And the people that go here are going to remember things. They're going to keep knowing how to read, how to write. They're going to remember a lot of their civilization's advancements. But the Dorians that stay over here are going to forget all that stuff. Stay tuned because we're going to hear from the Ionians again in a few minutes. All right, so this is called a dark age because it's a time when knowledge goes dark, when people forget a lot of things, and because of that, they don't educate their children, and so advancements stop happening. So they did not build cities in their civilization. During this time, they did not make art, music, or literature, so they didn't write anything down. And during this time, trade is going to stop. So they're going to stop learning how to make things that other people want to buy. They're going to stop trading with other civilizations, which means cultural diffusion is going to stop. And that's one of the reasons that their knowledge gets lost, because they're not passing their knowledge on to other people, and they're not learning things from other people either. During this time, because they did not value education, writing was forgotten and poverty increased. So people during this time are going to be poor, and there's not going to be a lot of money or supplies around. There's not going to be a surplus of resources, which is part of the reason why they don't have time to learn about and invent new stuff. Now, even though they did forget writing, the Dorians were master storytellers. And this is the time when Homer's stories are going to be passed down from generation to generation. They're going to tell their kids those stories, and the stories of the Trojan War and people trying to get back from that. And that's how they're going to preserve their religion and their history. And then eventually, when people learn to write again, they're going to write that down. So in the last section of our early Greek civilizations, we're going to come back to those Ionians that we talked about. So these are the Greeks the Mycenaeans that fled when the Dorians took over and settled in Ionia. In 750 BCE, when the Dorians are declining, the Ionians are going to, now it says settled on the Greek mainland, but I really like to think of it as the fact that they came back. Now, obviously, this is a few hundred years later, so it's not the same people, but it's their descendants, their children's children's children that are coming back, and they are resettling the Greek mainland that group of people originally came from. And when they come back, they're going to bring back all of that knowledge that they took with them and that they did preserve and they did keep learning about, which is the reason why we know things about the Greeks, even though there was a dark age, because the Dorians told stories and the Ionians brought back the knowledge that they kept. So the Ionians are going to come back to the Greek mainland, and they are going to bring with them Greek culture, crafts, and they're going to bring back the Phoenician alphabet. So like the Phoenicians in Mesopotamia. That might be familiar to you if you're familiar with the word phonics, like when we are learning to read, because a lot of our alphabet comes from the Phoenicians, thanks to the Ionians bringing it back. In the 700s BCE, the oral poetry or stories that had been passed down through the generations during the Dark Age by people telling stories was compiled or put together into what's now known as Homer's the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad is the story of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey is the story of a Greek war hero named Odysseus and his attempt to get back home from the Trojan War to Greece. But he accidentally makes Poseidon angry, and so Poseidon puts lots of obstacles in his way, and it takes him 10 years to get home. So he's been at the war for 10 years, and then it takes him 10 years to go from here to here. And he actually ends up going over here and all the way to Italy and coming back in the story. Now, if we were at school, I have a really awesomely animated cartoon video of that. I don't have the disc at home, but I might see if I can try and find it online for you guys. All right, so if you have any questions about the early Greek civilizations or these doodle notes or anything that I've said in it, please shoot me a comment or send me an email, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And so you guys keep getting your work done, try and relax, don't stress out, and please wash your hands.